Formula One is on the hunt for new teams for its next era, which begins in 2021, which slightly frighteningly is less than 2 years away now. We know there'll be a rules revolution, another one, and the hope is that F1 will become perhaps more affordable and we can close up the competitive order in the grid and give more teams a chance to compete at the front. Scott Mitchell, our F1 reporter, is here with me to discuss some comments that we've had from F1 boss Chase Carey about F1 talking to potential new teams. And Scott's drawn up his own list of the types of teams he thinks F1 should be targeting. So let's get straight into it, Scott. It's pretty obvious where we're going to start. This is an Audi Formula E car. Why should Audi be the kind of team that F1 wants to get for 2021?
Well, a lot of the conversation, speculation about F1 new team or new engine or whatever has been around Porsche. We know that they've been at the negotiating table or at the table for engine rule framing and whatnot for a long time now, but there's never been any sort of concrete evidence of them actually being willing to put their money where their mouth is, or put an entry where their mouth is. And the reason for suggesting Audi is that basically we know that Audi's in Formula E already, otherwise wouldn't have that in the background. But we also know that Porsche is coming into Formula E as well. They're going to be competing against one another. Again, after, I mean, that didn't work in LMP1 in the World Endurance Championship, but they're sister companies, all part of the Volkswagen group, and it doesn't make sense. And I know from when I covered Formula E, and that Audi has its reservations about going up against Porsche. Not from a competitive point of view. I'm sure everyone at Audi thinks that they're better than Porsche, but they don't see the purpose or what it really brings the company as a whole. So I just think that there's a company decision to be made there, and Audi has already been in Formula E. It's been there for a long time. It's got a lot out of it. Porsche is currently gearing up for its first foray into Formula E. So realistically, you're looking at those two and saying, okay, well, which of these isn't going to go all guns blazing in FE? It kind of makes sense to move Audi out of it rather than completely detonate Porsche's preparations and focus it elsewhere. Audi's never been in F1. It would be a big boost for Formula One to have a marque like Audi. And we know that Audi's in FE to boost its electric vehicle range, but the e-tron moniker that it's given its FE race car and had in LMP1 before is about its electric and hybrid vehicle range. And F1 has hybrid technology. Despite what a lot of people think, F1 is much bigger than Formula E. The commercial gains you'd get out of being in F1 is going to dwarf being in FE, even though FE is your all-electric thing. So Audi would get something out of being in F1. It would get relevant technology as well, and the benefits for F1 are obvious because you'd get an absolute powerhouse in Audi coming in and playing with the big boys.
Moving on then, that's the big manufacturer box ticked, you could say. Another type of team to go after, as we used to see in F1's history really until it outgrew this model, was the big teams from the junior ranks stepping up to F1 and having a go at the big boys. And if there was any team that was going to do that right now, you've highlighted this one, which is Prima Power team. And in that picture, they've of course got Mick Schumacher at the wheel this year in Formula 2. Yeah,
but I mean, Prima, it's difficult because when it comes to class acts in junior single-seater series that could do a job in F1, Prima aren't the only one. Obviously not. Carlin, Dams, ART, plenty of others that have shown in Formula 2, Formula 3, GP3, loads of categories, Formula Renault 3.5. That they are absolute top-class racing outfits. And I'm sure any of them, if it became realistic, would jump at the chance to do F1. And the reason for highlighting Prima is I think they've consistently proven in different formulas how damn good they are at running a race team. And they've also indicated in the past that they would be massively up for doing F1 if there was a customer car sort of opportunity. And 2021 and the rules overhaul is sort of the closest F1's going to come to presenting that. We know that there's a major divide at the moment in F1 over whether or not actual A and B team affiliation should be allowed, but if you're Ferrari, for example, which has had a relationship with Prima before, and you'll go, okay, well, I've got $400 or $500 million to spend in F1, but this new cost cap's coming in and I can only spend 200, 250. That money doesn't disappear. You're still willing to put that in if it furthers your cause. So why not put 100 or 150 million into a proper B team, properly affiliated to you, gives you a bit more political power because they're going to be voting in the same areas as you. You're going to be able to put your young drivers, maybe that's a way to get Mick Schumacher in the door in a Ferrari powered car before, and then building them up, developing them in F1 and then putting them in your senior team. So there's lots of benefits there. Prima gets an affordable way to come into F1 in a really competitive way. They're not going to be able to fight for wins and championships under that model, but if they've got an opportunity to go in there and fight for being 4th or 5th best again and prove themselves as we're not just the best junior racing team in the world, we can actually cut it right up here with everybody else. I can't see a downside to them doing that. And again, in a normal environment, there is no way for Prima to step up to F1. The sort of utopia that F1 is targeting for 2021 and beyond, I don't see why not.
You mentioned there the B team model that's being discussed, and I think as well as perhaps manufacturers being able to reposition some of that money they couldn't spend on a top team if there's a budget cap, it of course gives them somewhere to put staff as well, because one of the arguments the big teams are making is you're telling us to make 250 people redundant. Ferrari, in your example, could file a load of those people off to Prima and keep them in work. So that would be a good opportunity to bring new teams into F1 and keep everybody in work as well. We don't want people losing jobs. But let's stick on the B team theme briefly for a moment, because the next one you've highlighted is Andretti Autosport, and you've picked an affiliate for them as well.
Yeah, so we're ticking off the sort of the cliched type of team that you're going for. We've had the big manufacturer, we've had the mega junior single-seater team, and now we've got the big American racing giant as well. We haven't forgotten that there is a team from the United States in F1 at the moment, in Haas, and I haven't ignored the other very credible options out in the US like Penske or Ganassi. But with Andretti it does work because not only are they so well established, not only does the family have obvious F1 links and a brilliant pedigree in F1, they've got this emerging, or ongoing but still emerging in a way, partnership with McLaren. And it's that A team, B team divide that we talked about just now in F1 that sort of makes this quite viable, because, or makes it sensible at least, because McLaren is one of the teams that is very, very wary of the fact that F1 is going down this avenue of having a big team that partners up with a small team, because McLaren is one of the very few teams that fills this weird void in between that. It's a proper independent still, and it's getting caught out. It can't quite do the job that the big manufacturers are doing, but it's now being outgunned by B teams that sort of have these part sharing, or however you want to characterise the relationship.
And it doesn't want to become one of those B teams.
Exactly, it wants to do its own thing. But I think you need to be willing to evolve. Otherwise, F1 chews you up and spits you out, and that's kind of what's happening to McLaren at the moment. They haven't reacted well enough to the way F1 has changed in recent years. So Andretti are giving them something out in America at the moment with the Indy 500 tie-ups. We know that McLaren CEO Zach Brown is obviously a co-owner of the multi-named V8 supercars team out in Australia with the Walkinshaw Andretti United Autosports alliance, and there is history between the two teams, recent history, and an obvious willingness to work together, share technology, share resources, do and conquer amazing things around the world in motorsport. So to me, that strikes me as the obvious opportunity, and I'm sure everyone at Andretti and McLaren will have a million reasons why this isn't possible, but that strikes me as the most sensible way of going down that US market. F1 is really, really keen on cracking America. F1's been trying to do this for bloody ages now, but they're very keen to make it big in America. And I reckon to do that, not only do you need a driver, do you need more races, you need to have these big F1 team operations, and Haas is doing a wonderful job, and is an example of the sort of team that McLaren is a bit of not a fan of, shall we say. If that changed and their position changed, then bring Andretti in. You've got a second mega American team, a famous American name as well, and an opportunity for them to come into F1 and be successful.
Okay, so we're going to finish the list off with two companies who we've seen some presence from in recent years in F1. The first one of those is SMP Racing. We saw that name on the side of the Williams last year when they were back in Sergei Sirotkin. That deal hasn't continued into 2019, but SMP remain massively committed to motorsport programs all over the world. And right here we've got their LMP1 project, which has had some high-profile drivers in it, such as Jenson Button, for example. So they're taking this very seriously, and they're clearly keen to be at the top level of world motorsport. Could you see them realistically making a switch and doing this sort of project, but in F1?
I think it's certainly worth F1 sort of sounding them out to see if they'd be interested in. The main reason for including SMP, as you say, there is that previous connection to F1, and it is ongoing in a sense because Sergei Sirotkin, they still back Sergei, and he is still on the fringes of F1. He's back with Renault now, behind the scenes in a development role. And the fact that they've still got the LMP1 project, as you say, shows that SMP is very serious. They've also invested a lot of money and time in a junior driver program that is very serious. It isn't just a case of, throw a bunch of money at some randoms and hopefully they get somewhere. They're taking it very seriously. It goes all the way down to F4. But the problem is, if you've got that initiative, but you've got nowhere for those drivers to go at the pinnacle, what's the point? What are you ultimately doing it for? Because the LMP1 operation is going to give you a finite return on investment. And the same actually goes for the Russian Grand Prix, which is obviously a fairly recent addition to the F1 calendar. It's important for F1 because it's a big market for them to get into. But much like the SMP Young Driver Initiative, does it not have a short-term shelf life if there's no local interest, if there's no driver for people to get excited about? And while just because they've got an LMP1 team and just because they funded Sirotkin at Williams doesn't mean that SMP can suddenly afford to run their own F1 team. And okay, they've got this a partnership in LMP1 that allows them to enter that arena, but F1's a different ballgame. But again, this is where the idea of cost caps and A-B team affiliations come into play, because SMP does have this in now at Renault, where Sirotkin is back. And Renault is one of those teams, along with McLaren, that doesn't have an obvious affiliate. It doesn't, and it's wary of the threats that are posed to it if that threat doesn't get eliminated, and Renault then has to act. So, not saying that is an obvious way to get SMP in, but it's practical. There are reasons for both parties to sort of at least go to the table and chat. And if anyone is going to put together a consortium to have a proper all-Russian F1 team, it's going to be SMP, because they've got the links, they've got drivers. There's obviously serious pull and finance behind the scenes. Otherwise, why would Jenson Button be able to drive for them? He's not just going to go and race for a bunch of no-hopers, is he? His time is valuable, and he's a class act. So, again, slightly different to maybe the cliched sort of area that you normally go for if you're looking for a new F1 team, but it ticks a lot of boxes. And I actually think, having met a couple of the guys behind the scenes at SMP, I think they'd be quite an interesting, I think they'd definitely be a lively addition to the F1 grid.
Yeah, I think the key thing to remember is that we're not saying all of these organisations could step into F1 as it is now. This is entirely dependent on the type of model F1 is offering teams that it's talking to about 2021, when the grid could look very different. Let's finish on a slightly confusing note, because we're going to talk about a brand that already has a significant presence in F1.
Red Bull.
Well, no. We've won, the third Red Bull team. We're on to Aston Martin. Big tie-up with Red Bull, as you can see. That's some decent real estate on an F1 car you've got there. But Red Bull now has a serious, hopefully long-term manufacturer partner in Honda, whose logos we can also see on this image. So what we're dreaming up here is a scenario where Aston Martin can get into F1 kind of in its own right, aren't we?
Yeah, especially because Aston Martin is clearly investing heavily in motorsport at the moment. We know that there's the Aston Martin Blessed DTM project. They've reaffirmed their commitment in the World Endurance Championship, and they're interested in looking at what's available to them on the hypercar side out in the WEC for the future regulations there. And obviously our Young Driver of the Year award that has been around since 1989, and now Aston Martin is the fresh new face of that in conjunction with Autosport and the BRDC. So they're super committed to motorsport, and they've been around F1 now with Red Bull for a little while. They've explored their own engine opportunities, so we know that they're not just sort of making noise for the sake of making noise. It's serious. They're evaluating ways that they can sort of further the brand of the company and get something back for it. And okay, so how do you do that in F1? And there are two ways for Aston to go with this. They can go down the engine route themselves, which is what they've talked about in the past. I think for a bit as well, there was a little bit of speculation over whether that could be Red Bull's future engine partner. But that's a massive commitment for Aston Martin to make in an arena where it's not a specialist. What it is very good at, as we've seen in Le Mans and in other examples, it's a fantastic race team when it has the right direction. So perhaps if there is a cost cap of 150, 200 million dollars, euros, pounds, whatever currency you want to put on it, maybe there is an opportunity there for Aston to say, actually, maybe engine isn't the way to go, but we've got money, we've got serious partners as well, because that's the other thing. What a few of the other examples we've given might not necessarily be able to enter F1 on their own terms. Aston Martin is one of the very few international brands that I can see putting together the sort of commitment that allows them to do something themselves. So perhaps they find the right engine partner to go with. Perhaps they extend the Red Bull relationship and use that in to sort of buddy up with Honda, and it becomes an Aston Martin Honda deal. Don't know. Maybe they find someone that can basically build an independent engine, badge it as an Aston Martin. There are lots of options there, and it all comes down to, as you said when we started talking about them, it comes down to what F1 can offer, what infrastructure F1 puts in place. But this is sort of a slightly different example of a big manufacturer that could come in to F1. It's already it's been testing the waters, shall we say, in recent years. Maybe 2021 is the way that Aston Martin takes a running jump and cannonballs into the pool, to continue that very bad analogy.
And that would be fantastic for F1 to be able to say to prospective manufacturers or companies, Aston Martin, as you say, put the toe in the water, and then they liked what they saw, so they went for it, and now we offer them a platform that enables them to do it on their own terms and at a much more affordable rate. That, for me, is a fantastic list that Scott's put together, and I'm now putting all my hopes on all 5 of those teams joining the grid in 2021, and we bring back pre-qualifying and everything. It'll be fantastic. But we want you to let us know which teams you would like to see F1 talking to, or F1 trying to get to join the grid in 2021. And maybe like Scott has, let us know the circumstances that you think would be required to get them in.